some ways, okay, I hope the recording is well done. So where do we go from here? And I think Europe has a tremendous role to play in all of this. By rethinking how to conduct relations, by rethinking what it means when they go one block to the other. What is clear is, given what's happening in Ukraine, given in Gaza, that the global systems are not settling these issues easily or well. So we have to somehow take a step back and try to understand this thing better. A few days ago, President Xi Jinping started his European tour in France. And the way the media covered was interesting. It was seen as a way of deepening division among Western countries. Why are we going to France, then to Hungary, and then to Serbia? And somehow it's seen as China is trying to break out of these collective instruments which are trying to push into one corner. But I would submit that's not a very productive way of doing business. So, driven by economics, politics now has to catch up. Institutions have to catch up. And we have to do a deeper analysis as to where do we go from here fundamentally, for some very important reasons. First and foremost, as a human society, our human survival depends on collective action, whether it's to do with the environment or it's to do with equity. Without collective action, it's not possible to resolve it. Foreign policy, we have an ambassador and maybe some others who have a lot of experience in foreign affairs. Foreign affairs fundamentally has been driven by a lot of bilateral issues or a lot of issues dealing with the West or how you negotiate this thing. But a large part of the future foreign relations is to do with survival. In the next 15, 20 years, would we be able to sustain ourselves? So we have to find a better way of thinking through the next steps. So what are the next chunks of things we have to think about? We have to redefine our principles of engagement with each other, between nations, between groups of nations, and fundamentally at the United Nations. So in a sense, we have to what I call back to the future kind of instrument, that we have to find, again, better guiding principles. And that has many implications. Our collective action will define whether we can meet planetary challenges. Our collective action will define whether we can put people first fundamentally. It's very easy, and there's a lot of, as an economist, I pretend to be an economist, you can very easily convince people to subsidize the rich. But the minute you try subsidizing the poor, everyone has a view on it. And they say, no, you can't do it for macroeconomic reasons, for this and that. But somehow, subsidizing the rich is easier to defend. Huh? The other dimension, first is defining principles. The second is defining the balance between global thinking and regional thinking. We must make progress on both matters. And I'll give you an example of the Security Council, actually. When we had a great Secretary General, Kofi Annan, who I had the privilege to represent him in China. And we used to spend a lot of time with him because he will come to China quite often. And if you remember, he had initiated a lot of reform thinking, at least some reforms, but a lot of thinking. And one of them was about the Security Council. You must remember that, Ambassador, because that was very visible. I tried to argue, and if you remember, there was the big debate was whether new countries should be added to the Security Council, like India and Nigeria to represent Africa or South Africa. And I was trying to argue that you have to find a way to present incentives at the sub-regional, regional level in order to fully represent peace and security at the global level. For instance, if in South Asia today we have a rotating Security Council membership, and each country has to represent the whole of South Asia, it puts a lot of pressure on those countries to have peace in their own neighborhood or to have better conditions. Otherwise, you cannot represent them properly. So we have to think of incentives which allow us to bring people together, countries together. A third point which I would like to highlight is that we somehow have to move away from a zero-sum context, meaning that my gain should not be your loss and vice versa. But unfortunately, current international relations are being driven very much by that notion. And this idea of ring fencing different countries. Some large countries need perpetual enemies because that's a good way to justify a lot of investment in arms. A few years ago, when my good friend Jean-Paul Fitoussi, who sadly passed away last year, he and I set up the Global Sustainability Forum in Rome. And some years ago, before COVID, we gave an award to Costa Rica. And I acknowledge the former president of Costa Rica among us. And why was that? Because they took the tremendously important decision to eliminate an army. And they used that dividend to invest in people. And the remarkable thing was that incomes went up, environment security went up, people's lives improved. But these are very difficult, politically charged decisions. And they're like 20, 25, 30 countries even, which one could argue they could take that next step. So we have to find some ways of moving from zero-sum game, that belonging in groups or blocks is fundamentally as potential zero-sum game, meaning my gain is your loss. And we have to, this was actually the reasoning behind the United Nations. And sadly, we have not been able to give the United Nations the role and purpose it deserves, and to use the United Nations much more fully and effectively. The UN actually does very good on slogans. So one slogan we have or had was, we need to be fit for purpose. Great slogan. We're good at inventing that. Huh? So we have to find a way to make the UN fit for purpose, to capture this new world which is fast in front of us. But the policies and the politics is not catching up on that. So in some ways, as I've tried to argue, we are actually getting close to a potential San Francisco moment when we have to do a rebirthing of the United Nations, but anchoring ourselves in guiding principles which reflect an emerging shift, not emerging, a shift in power relations and the emergence of many different groups. Power relations are fundamental to the way we govern, and we have to recognize that and not shy away from it. And I would then argue or submit that multilateralism is the chapeau under which you have to position all the bilateral conversations, because ultimately you have to look after your people. I will go to a final comment, because I had told my great leader here that I would not go more than 20 minutes. Language is important. What we call things, semantics is important. How we term things. Non-alignment, Global South are seen as actually almost negative statements these days, right? There are a lot of articles these days on Global South where they argue, is China dominant or not dominant in the Global South? How many countries have the same interests as China and India? To me, that's actually not the argument here at all. Each country must pursue their bilateral interests the way they see it. But how they relate with others fundamentally has to be in a framework for human survival and the framework for sustainable peace. And I would hope, well, maybe in this brainstorming, we could even give a thought of reinventing these terms on Global South, non-alignment, and to find a way that we can move ourselves away from the promoting this division and discord into promoting harmony and sustainability. Yeah? And I know this may seem as supremely unwise as a statement because it's not founded on practical real world But I think the time has come to start thinking of shaping the next stages. The UN this autumn is going to have the Future Summit. But when you look at the agenda and others, there's a lot there which needs to be, I think, debated and pushed forward. Because ultimately you have to bring the two arcs together, power relations and human survival. You have to find a way to unknot it. And I think maybe there are other ways which we can work on to, after all, the European Union got pushed forward because some people got together and said, let's do it better. And that was a huge step forward. The UN, in some ways similar. I was very touched by a wonderful photograph in Roberto Savio's office here, where it's one of the first North-South conversations with Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and a great photograph on the beach, but behind in the ocean is a frigate, a Navy vessel aimed for war. But we are fundamentally trying to promote peace. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Okay. Thanks. So now we go by alphabetic order. We have a participant that, because of a mishap, Marco Piazza, who has been organizing this meeting, did not receive information. He was asked to participate in the very beginning, but then we lost contact and today with us. And as you do not have a CV because it have been distributed, let me explain to you that he's a professor of contemporary history at the University of Rome, but he's also a researcher and very active in a number of institutions of academic level. And it is the letter A, Acanfora, so it's the first speaker. If you want to speak or you want to pass? I want to pass, please. You're passing. Then we go to Oscar Arias.
Roberto, I prefer to pass, if you don't mind.
Okay. Then we go to Ambassador Bernardini.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you for organizing this meeting. I think you started saying that we talk a lot about Ukraine and Gaza. We don't talk about Global South. Well, you know, just this first statement, it's a good start of a discussion. First of all, I think being in Europe, it's normal that we talk about Ukraine and Gaza. I mean, this is very much at the center of our history and we at the center of our worries. So it's very difficult to accept that we should not regard this huge threat because there is a Global South issue. On the contrary, I mean, this is the complexity of the situation in which we are now. We have to deal with huge security issues. We are, for the first time, at least in my life, talking about the threat of a war as something which is not an imaginative issue, but a concrete issue. We are discussing Europe again, the possibility that of war scenarios. And the issue of Gaza as well is another very fundamental issue. So the problem is that we cannot divide the issues and making one more relevant or less relevant than the others. We are a complexity that we have to face. Regarding Global South, even if this is a discussion that has taken place in several quarters, what is Global South remains a question. I think we have a problem of South. Global South, it seems to me, it's a kind of definition that requires some discussion. But from my experience, what is very difficult to digest is to find countries that have acknowledged an incredible development in recent years that still wants to become the spokesperson of the South. This is something that probably has to change. We still have a problem of development. We do have a problem of South. What we don't need is to have countries being able to find their own way for development, to continue to present themselves as the countries that have to speak on behalf of somebody else. On the contrary, I think that we have seen in recent times, especially in Africa, some very important developments that could allow us to looking at the development issues on a different ground in a very positive way. So basically we are confronted with the security and economic issues at the same time. So I think that Khalid Malik has referred to the Future Summit, where both issues are there. I want just to flag that probably the Future Summit is an issue for connoisseurs. There is no discussion in the media and the world about the Future Summit. So basically we are confronted with huge challenges, but discussion on these matters is taking place elsewhere. It's taking place at the UN, yes, but not in a way and probably with a kind of support and political strength that will require to fix this issue. I will leave it now with my comments to this point, because I think there are a number of very important issues to discuss, both on security and economy, from the reform of the Security Council, which is a very dear issue for us, to the issue of development debt, especially debt, which is one of the main problems that we are discussing and facing at the international level since many years. Thank you.
Then we go to Ingeborg, Branes Ingeborg, please.
Honorable friends, happy to be with you. It is not obvious to be an active peace worker in the Northwest these days, as the mainstream credo is that weapons are leading to peace. So being a pacifist, we easily come up against not being patriotic enough. So we are deeply saddened and deeply angered by the fact that we have not managed to prevent war. We have failed. We, Europe, we, the peace movement, even we, the UN Security Council, with its Achilles heel of the veto, stopping potentially forward-looking processes. Peace. So I'm speaking from Norway, and we were proud to be a small country with internal high-level welfare, with thinking that a friendly country would never be attacked. We thought that being supportive of a strong UN was the best deterrence that we could have, and providing help and being in solidarity with those that had less. So today, when we are weaponizing more than we have ever seen before, we need to find hope elsewhere, because we have now 47 new American military bases in the Nordic countries. It is totally unheard of. So then the South must help us out of this situation. We have to put our hope in the South, in the non-aligned countries, neutral countries, in women, in beauty, in indigenous people. So I hope that we can go in depth with discussion. How do we bring the ideas from the South of living in harmony more than we do in the West environment into overall thinking? And if we look at the research that has been done by Erika Chenoweth, it's very encouraging, because she says that non-violent also, when it comes to efficiency, much better than the militaristic way of thinking that we are living in. And there is particularly a thinker in Africa that is inspiring me these days, and it is Akil Mbembe. And I think we have a great pleasure, all of us, in reading what he says. I think we need encouragement. So if you allow, Roberto, I'll read a poem to you by the Persian poet Hafiz. It goes like this. I sometimes forget that I was created for joy. My mind is too busy. My heart is too heavy for me to remember that I have been called to dance the sacred dance of life. I was created to smile, to love, to be lifted up, and to lift up others. O sacred one, untangle my feet from all that ensnares. Free my soul that we might dance and that our dancing might be contagious. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we go to Boaventura dos Santos.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be in this distinguished high-level international community by Zoom. And I follow on Ingeborg's comment now, because I think that there are many differences Mr. Malik already mentioned before the time of the 50s and our time. And before our time, around the 1930s, for instance, here in Europe, there were some meetings like this one until 1936, when Germany left the League of Nations. And in fact, people were discussing the design of institutions, because institutions were faring behind, even though all the countries were preparing for war. And in a sense, we are precisely at the same time. How many years are we before the Third World War? We never know. I mean, the buildup of military bases, as Ingeborg said, and the NATO involvement in Ukraine and so on, does seem to be that we are, maybe for some people, already on the eve of a nuclear war, a global war, which is even much more devastating. Well, in 1950s, Robert was there, and I'm lucky that I had a very good friend. I was a young secretary there in Bandung, Samir Amin. And Samir Amin also mentioned me lots of interesting things about that meeting. At that point, there were two different models of society, the Western one and the Soviet one. In fact, there were two models of civilization. The idea of the new man, for instance, which had a Soviet version, a fascistic version with Mussolini, and a Nazi version with Hitler. But in any case, they were the ideas that a new civilization was being developed there, and all of them deviated from the capitalist norm, which at that point was already the USA norm after the Second World War. And in fact, Europe was itself, the former colonial power was itself divided between the two blocks, and Yugoslavia was there precisely as a sense of trying to defining a third way of development. The Soviet bloc at the time had a very great advantage, because after the Congress of People in Baku in 1921, the Soviet bloc had been helping the colonial struggles of many countries. I know there were some observers, even for Mozambique at the time, which was a Portuguese colony there. So, and the United States in this regard on the politics against colonialism was very poor at that time. So there were some advantages for the Soviet Union, but in a sense, these countries were looking for the positive side of two very different systems. Both systems have positive aspects and negative aspects, and they were trying to get the positive aspects of both. Well, today is a very different time. Why? because from my perspective, looking from my epistemologies of the South, from my working in the global South, in Latin America and Africa, and also in India, I think that they are very similar, the two systems now. Non-alignment between China and the USA or Western capitalism, I see them as two variants of capitalism. So we don't have an alternative, a civilizatory or civilizational alternative. Is less exciting in that regard, because I think that they are just too similar in a way. Both of them are capitalistic, even though they are very different in their ways. State capitalism versus multinational capitalism. Both of them are autocratic. I have to say that, in fact, Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania, had a beautiful say. Well, yes, we are a single party system, but the United States is also a single party system, with the exception there are two parties, but is also a single party system. And in a sense, this distinction between democracies and autocracies is a bit ridiculed when seen from the global South. But where is the democracy in the United States today, where we see the protests? It is easier to commit a genocide than to protest against a genocide. Where is democracy? Well, this cynicism and hypocrisy is very well noted. The second, the third idea is now we have a new demand. The people that are probably not in this room, but they are very important now. You know, opposite to 1955, is the civil society and the new demands, particularly in ecological terms. And in this respect, the two systems that seek some kind of non-alignment, they are very similar. When we look at CO2 emissions, for instance, and the people, the young people, the indigenous people, the people, the peasants all over the world, they don't want an alternative model of development. They want an alternative to development. They want good living. They want harmony with nature. They don't want, in fact, the destruction and the complete destruction of nature. In this sense, we don't see any alternative. In a sense, non-alignment is against both systems, the Chinese system and the American or Western system, because both of them are very, very detrimental to nature, which in fact they don't call nature, but Mother Earth. In fact, there are different philosophies instead of exploiting.
Your time is out.
Okay, I'm finished.
Thanks. Then we go to Cecilia Capanna.
Good evening to everybody. I don't have statements to make, but just wishes. Since there are many problems that you guys are more professional and proficient than me to explain, and by what I see, we are in a similar situation to what was the Cold War, but with differences, as Boa just said. Mostly, we have the climate change problem, first of all, on top of the list, of course. Then we have the young people, next generation problem, which is huge. Then we have the North-South dialogue and non-aligned countries making connector between the blocks in terms of trading, mostly. We have many women, the future of the planet, and we have many issues, and the war, as Ingeborg said. So we have mostly also the problem of weapons, and that means always about trade, the multinational making weapons that are leading actually the international and the world scene. This is the problem, because we can talk about peace, we can talk about a UN that has big limits, and it showed during all this year after the Second World War what are these limits, because other conflicts have never been avoided, as we can see nowadays, in two very key points of the world, Ukraine and Palestine. And so my wish is this. The south of the world has the countries that own the supplies for ecological transition. This is the truth and the reality. And nowadays, there is a second colonization because of this. And we know it. We can see it in Congo, we can see it in Chile, also because they have lithium, they have coltan, they have everything that is needed for the transition. And these countries should be not active, not aligned countries in order to provide peace to the world and avoid conflict between the two blocs and other countries that are involved in economical stuff. Because yes, as you can say, there are religion problems, political problems, geopolitical problems, but mostly is everything about money as usual. So I think my wish is the next generation in the south of the world, which is also the youngest part of the world, because Europe and the western part of the world are for 1/3 and even more plus 65 years old. So, and no children are getting born. They are not. We are not having children. So how about in 30 years? What our leaders, our governments, what are they going to do? So they will be empty countries, always keeping the chairs, not making an intergenerational dialogue, excluding young people from the political debate. Instead, in the south of the world, as the Niger, for instance, they are for almost a quarter of the population under 25 years old. So this means, and they are having the average of the children of a woman is 7. So what does it mean? My wish is the south of the world has in front of their eyes what the north of the world, the western and the models we know did. They could be non-aligned, and besides that, they could be not making the same mistakes. So flipping over the situation with next generations. I know a bunch of organizations and activists in Africa and in South America for climate change, and they are determined, and they are funding very huge and strong networks, and also leaders of technology and trade and economy. The models have to be changed. I was so sad after the pandemic to see that was a huge opportunity for the entire world to change the model, and it didn't happen. So my wish is this, is that the next generation will be successful in flipping up what we did so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Franco Dinelli.
Okay, thanks a lot for this invitation. And probably from my CV, it results that I am a physicist, that I study mainly nanotechnology. I also teach arms control at the Faculty of Political Science for the course of Peace Studies in Pisa. But I am also president of the Study Center of Pax Christi, Italy. I also collaborate with the international section. What I would like to, taking over from, I will start to comment on several issues which are very important, like the one you made. The work that I'm trying as a president of Study Center is exactly to try to form the new generation, because the only hope we have at the moment in Italy is to form new generation, because at the moment, for instance, now there will be the elections for the European parliament, and there is not even a single candidate that would take the important issue at the parliament in Europe. Okay, maybe there are a few of them, they will not be elected. If they will be elected, the party control is such that they will never take the issues that you, excuse me if I call you Cecilia, but this is the case. So we have to form the new generation. In this sense, I'm trying to work, and for instance, in Italy, nobody speaks about making a new paradigm of relationship with underdeveloped countries, for Africa, for instance. I'm trying to organize meetings where I'm trying to inform, also Monsignor Yameogo, we discuss always to inform better the Italians about what's going on in Africa and the situation that is changing now. Another important issue is the UN. The Italians don't know anything about UN. Later on, Maurizio will tell you about the translation of some important documents of UN, but typical the government and the parties, they don't care about translating the most important documents, and Italy, it's basically, there is no knowledge of what the UN is doing, and also why the UN is not working and is not actually solving the conflicts that you mentioned even today. What I would like to discuss is that another initiative which I've been involved with a group of jurists in Italy, including Professor Raffaele Coppola, another important jurist in Italy, that they will, since 1997, they have been trying to put out a frame in order to solve the problem of the debt of the underdeveloped countries like Africans, but also other ones. They started in 1997 with a declaration against usury in a small place, beautiful place in the south called Sant'Agata dei Goti, and then more recently, in 2017, they managed to have the Vatican support. There is a letter by the Vatican Dicastery Secretary who sent a letter to the government by 97 was, I think, Gentiloni, but afterwards as well with Conte, in order to take a declaration, a resolution at the General Assembly of UN, in which they ask the International Court of Justice to pronounce themselves about the structural problems bonds that determine the debitorial situation of countries compared to the Charter of UN. Because if you carefully compare the situation, what determines the actual debitorial situation, it's basically, if you look at that, it falls in the case of usury. Also the case of Greece in Europe. It's another important issue that European Union, which was created to determine peace and harmony between the European countries, was a failure like the failure in the Yugoslav war. The situation at the moment is that finally the Italian government did not bring this resolution at the General Assembly because they said that the allies would not support this resolution. At the moment, the status of this process is that they will ask for, these jurists are asking the African Union to support that and to bring it to the General Assembly. And I think I have finished my time, but if you wish, I can give you more information by email, and probably next time we'll involve also Professor Coppola, who is more into technical details than myself. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Roberto. Good afternoon to you. Good morning to me. In the first place, let me thank again my good friend Roberto for the kind invitation to join this webinar. It is a real privilege. Let me start by pointing out that, incredible as it may sound, the very notion of global south is being contested. Articles have been published in leading newspapers saying that the very term should be retired. It should not be used because it is polarizing and it is divisive. I say, what kind of argument is that? Since when are we asking for terms in the social sciences to be retired because they make some people uncomfortable, because they don't like them, because they think that somehow they polarize? According to that, we would have to retire the very term social class. So I find it quite extraordinary that just at the time when the global south is coming into its own, as it has in the course of the past few years, there are voices that call for the retirement of the very term. So it is important to understand, that global south is not a geographical term, because part of the argument of these people is to say, well, China and India, for example, are not in the southern hemisphere. They are in the northern hemisphere. Well, this is not geography 101. Global south is a geopolitical term. And what it refers to is to those countries that until now basically have been excluded from the existing system, countries that have not had a place at the table. So some people say, well, there are many differences. There are countries in this group that are very rich and others that are very poor. Well, but they all share this one quality. They have been excluded from the current system, from the liberal international order that is now in crisis, from the so-called rules-based order that is being invoked so often, and some people would say so hypocritically. So the first point I would like to emphasize is that the global south is back in course. It is here to stay, and it is a very useful and important concept to understand the current dynamic in world politics. I would say that in the course of the past couple of years, we are seeing a turnaround in world politics in a way that perhaps we hadn't seen since 1990, since the end of the Cold War. And at the very center of that change is the rise of the global south. As you may recall, it has been argued that the war in Ukraine would signal that the big cleavage in the world is between democracy and autocracy, that those that stand with one side in the war belong to the democratic camp, and those that stand on the other belong to the autocratic camp. Well, as it happens, many of the biggest democracies in the world are not matching that neat division. Countries like India, like Pakistan, like Indonesia, like Brazil, like Mexico, have not taken the stand that, say, NATO has taken on the war in Ukraine. So how can we say that the war in Ukraine signals that the biggest cleavage in the world is between democracy and autocracy? I would say that what it signals, and we've seen this later with other developments, is that the biggest cleavage in the world today is between North and South, between the global North and the global South. So that is the first point I would like to underscore. The second one, and that has been made by previous speakers, is that there's been a seismic change in this regard, and what the World Bank has referred to as the wealth shift from the North Atlantic to the Asia Pacific. The fastest growing region in the world today is the Asia Pacific, and some have argued that we're now basically moving into what has been called the Asian century, something which my good friend Kishore Mahbubani, a Singaporean diplomat and thinker, has been arguing very strongly. By 2030, projections indicate that China will displace the US as the largest economy in market prices. It already has displaced it in PPP terms. Projections also indicate that by 2050, 7 of the top 10 economies in the world will be non-Western ones. A Brazilian political scientist, Oliver Stunkel, who has a chapter in a book in which Roberto Savio and I participated on active non-alignment, has coined the term post-Western world. And it seems to me there's something to it. One indicator that I'm very fond of is that today there are more billionaires in Beijing than in New York City. which it seems to me is a very telling statistic. The fastest growing large economy in 2024 will be India at 6.5%. So the global south has thus become quite a powerhouse. The third point is that this has radically altered both north-south and south-south relations. The diplomatie de carrière de doléances of the past century, this victimhood diplomacy, has been replaced by something very different, what has been called collective financial statecraft, embodies in entities like the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, the New Development Bank, the so-called BRICS Bank, and the Belt and Road Initiative. There's a whole new world out there in terms of development financing for countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. As you know, the Belt and Road Initiative has, in its 10 years, has spent $1 trillion, over $1 trillion in various infrastructure projects across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The biggest infrastructure project going on in Latin America right now is the port of Chancay in Peru, a $3.6 billion project being built by a Chinese company. And that will be the most significantly largest port on the west coast on South America when it is inaugurated later this year. My fourth point is that this major shift in the world political economy has led to significant changes in world politics as well. The creation of the G20 and of the BRICS are expressions of this. Informal groups that do not have the heavy bureaucracy of the UN or the Bretton Woods institutions, but that perform a very critical role in world affairs, what has been called the concertation model, as Canadian political scientist Andrew Cooper has shown in a new book. And in the past 2 years, the eruption of the global south in world affairs has been evident. It first became evident with the war in Ukraine, where it was a very mixed reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but especially on the negative reaction to the unilateral Western sanctions on Russia. This was seen as an unprecedented effort to make a European war into a global war, simply because it was taking place in Europe. It went down very badly, as did the efforts to get Latin American countries to provide weapons to Ukraine, which was unanimously rejected. Countries like Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Chile were formally approached by the United States and by Germany. The German chancellor visited South America, especially for the purpose of asking for weapons for Ukraine, and it was unanimously rejected.
Okay, okay.
I'll finish right now. And the expansion of the BRICS group was a significant element on that, as has been the war in Gaza and the reaction that we have seen to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, next speaker is Mushaid, if you want to make an intervention.
Okay. Yes, I'm ready for the intervention.
Please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Savio, who is truly a man of action, a man of ideas, and who's a bridge between the global north and the global south, and who's quite legendary because he's the only living person probably on the planet who took part in the historic Afro-Asian conference in Bandung almost 70 years ago. So we are proud of our association and affiliation with Dr. Roberto Savio. And my compliments to my good friend, Mr. Khalid Malik, for a very incisive overview of the global emerging scenario. And basically, the focus, which is, I think, quite correct and clear, is that the new global context is driven by economics, and which has altered the current state of power relations and the established order. And this view of Mr. Khalid Malik is also corroborated by recent statements by world statesmen. I was reading some time back the article by Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor. He said he talked of a epochal tectonic change in his article in Foreign Affairs last year. Zeitenwende, he called it in Germany. Xi Jinping has said that we are witnessing once in a century changes. Changes which have not been seen in a century are now occurring before our own eyes. And last year, I think it was, or before that, President Macron had told the French diplomats in Paris that 300 years of Western hegemony is coming to an end. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll just make 3 short points. And taking off, my first point is taking off from the statistic provided by Mr. Khalid Malik, that by 2030, 80% of the middle class in the world will belong to the global south. And I think that's a very important change, shift, economic change, which has geopolitical ramifications. And to add to that, I would like to mention that there are today 193 members of the United Nations. Out of 193 members, 130 have more trade with China than they have with the United States. And out of the 193 members of the United Nations, 68 countries have already announced that they would like to do trade, not in the United States dollar, but in RMB, in rupee, in real, in rubles or rand. So already the process of de-dollarization is underway. And I think that is a very key element. And recently there was this study by Harvard University done by Professor Graham Allison. It's 52 pages. You can find it on the Google. The Great Tech Rivalry, China versus the United States. And I quote from that study, which says, China is overtaking the United States in high-tech manufacturing, whether it's robotics, whether it's 5G, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's cloud computing, whether it's STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So already we are seeing that a global change is very visible. The second point I'd like to make is that there are 2 very contrasting visions today in the world. One is an outmoded, archaic vision being presented by the United States, which is still security-driven, military-dominated, of seeking a new Cold War, trying to militarize international relations. The lady from Norway mentioned about the American bases in Nordic countries, 47 of them. I'd like to mention for our information, the US has 400 bases in Asia. And 5 more have been added recently in the Philippines. So 405 in Asia alone. So that, I think, shows very clearly where the US stands. And we have seen also that in the last 20 years after 9/11, the US squandered $6.5 trillion. This is according to the Brown University study, in the so-called war on terror. While at the same time, the last 10 years, China spent, and this was mentioned earlier by another speaker, $1 trillion in 3,000 projects in different parts of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and Europe. So that's these 2 contrasting visions. And in that regard, the Chinese vision of connectivity, economic-driven trade and investment has far more global resonance in the global south than the American vision of militarization of international relations. And finally, the third point I'd like to make is that we are witnessing 3 major conflicts in the world today: Ukraine, Gaza, and the emergence of a new Cold War spawned by the hawks in Washington, D.C. and the military-industrial complex of the U.S. In all 3 counts.
Shahid,
Yes.
I'm sorry, you have to keep the rest for your next intervention.
Okay.
We have
Thank
to
you.
keep going around the round. Thanks.
Okay.
Then now is Federico Mayor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President and good friend. I think that there have been many very interesting interventions. I would like to, from the very beginning, to say that after 78 years, the United Nations has never been able to implement the Charter. This is the reality. We have an excellent design, democratic design, multilateral design, wonderful, with the Declaration of the Human Rights. But the reality is that today, after 78 years, never has been applied the Charter that starts saying that we, the peoples, have resolved to save the succeeding generations from the horror of the war. And this is, in my view, what now today we must see how can we put into practice this wonderful multilateral system that was designed at the end of the Second World War. Why? Why has been not applied? Because of the veto. The veto of the 5 winners. The 5 winners of the Second World War, they have the possibility of not approving any of the suggestions made by the system of the United Nations. This was the reality until very recently, but now we are worse because we have now a United Nations system that is unable to put into practice the wonderful charter, but now we have also an European veto. Now Europe, as you know, the European Union must take the decisions by unanimity. And in this way, there is no possibility. Who is the partner of Putin in the Ukrainian war? Is the European Union? No. Is the G7 and NATO? Why? Because the G7 is, I repeat, unable to do this because also the veto. I think that we must now realize how important, as has been mentioned now very recently, has been mentioned the very important moment in which was the United Nations system inhabilitated. Why? Because perhaps you know the fantastic speech made by Eisenhower when passing the 20th of January of 1961, the power to John Fitzgerald Kennedy. What he said?
Yes.
He said the truth. And this is what the truth that we have today. He said that I am, after these years as President of the United States, I must declare to the peoples of America that I have never the power. The power is in the hands of the military industrial complex. And this is what we have today. This is exactly what we have today. We cannot make any kind of, because we the peoples, we are immediately under the veto of the 5 winners, but particularly of the United States. The G7 today takes the decisions. And what we can do, we must now try to have educated people. I remember when I had the pleasure of working in UNESCO with Michel Rocard and with Jacques Delors. And we said, education is not to know more things, and education is to be free and responsible, as it is said by the article number 1 of UNESCO's constitution. Free and responsible. Now we need to be free and responsible and to say, now, we do not accept anymore the veto in the United Nations and the veto in the European Union. And we do not accept that when there is a meeting on, for example, the environment, you know that these meetings of the COP, when we have these meetings, they say, oh yes, we have these decisions, but they are not binding. What is this? Who can say that the decisions adopted are not binding? Well, therefore now, my dear friends, I think that what we need is to think about the governance at the world level. Now we are in the hands of a plutocratic millionaires, and supremacist governance in the world as a whole. And now we must change. Until now was not feasible because we the people were not existing. We were always a male absolute power. But now, no, this is a good news. Now we recognize all the equal dignity of all the human beings. Now we recognize this. And we can express ourselves because we can participate, because with the technology, digital technology, we can express ourselves. Now the moment has arrived to say, no. And we can say no. And we can be all together, many institutions in the world, many scientific, academic, artistic institutions, political institutions, and to say no to the veto, no to a United Nations with all these capacities for immediately making them unable after 78 years of action. In the next month of November,
Enrico,
the Secretary General has said that will be a pact for the future. What I would very much like is to see all of us being members of this pact for the future in order to make the
Federico.
United Nations active. Nothing more. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Now we ask to Ambassador Ferrara will join it if he wants to speak now or he leaves for the next tour.
No, I can say something now if you like. So very, very briefly, thanks a lot for having me. Very interesting. I'm sorry for being late, but I just was able to hear some interesting remarks that are thought-provoking. And well, the situation where we are now, I would start by describing an anecdote that I witnessed personally just a few weeks ago. Because, you know, Italy has the responsibility of having the chairmanship of the G7, since the G7 was mentioned. And one of the main issue of this approach to this presidency was from the point of view of diplomats in charge of this, to have one motto, which is very important: the G7 is not enough. Because, as you know, a few months ago, this group of countries was described as a sort of steering committee of the free world, which is quite an exaggeration. Is far from being such. It is a group that has as a task to try to coalesce international consensus on global and transnational issues. Far from governing the world, on the contrary, it should be at the service of global governance. And the same applies to the G20. Why I mentioned the G20? Because one of the idea that we had was to have at the table the G20 Troika. I mean, the present presidency of the G20, which is Brazil, and the former one, India, and the next one, South Africa. So we deliberately invite them to come to the ministerial meeting in an attempt to start a dialogue on many things. We are not in agreement. On other things, there are the necessity to cooperate, especially transnational global issues like climate change, food security, and so on. So, there was no immediate response, but at the end of the day, the three countries declined this invitation because they did not think that this was the right format for them to participate as invited, and also started to question the agenda, the final statement, and so on. But all this was quite useful for us to understand that it's not enough to engage by invitation. You need to create an environment of mutual trust. And what is missing now as a fabric of the international relation and the international system today is exactly this idea of mutual trust. This is something that it must be of concern for everybody, not because we need that everybody thinks at the same manner on a specific issue, especially conflict like the case of Ukraine or now Gaza, but because we need to cooperate on many things. Now, at the same time, there is this trend towards polarization. Polarization means basically you have to take side, either with us or against us. And this is very damaging for international governance, because at the end of the day, you know, in the past we had the non-aligned countries, a glorious tradition. Today we have a different kind of countries that are non-alignable. So they don't want to take side, not because they are neutral or they are indifferent to the problem of mankind, but because they want to have their hands free. Because in a very changing, rapidly changing international environment, this hedging strategy of sitting on the fence doesn't mean not to be responsible stakeholders of the international order, but not to be obliged to take sides. So I think we have to respect that. We have to learn from this kind of attitude. And I think what we all need from both sides, not only the G7, G20, the Global South, and so on, is more humility, more attitude to listen, which something that is missing in the today international system. By the way, I think that what is revealing is this narrative of the power politics, great powers confrontation and hegemony, that's coming back to the international narrative. I think you have to take this very seriously, because it means that it gives some flesh to the concept of multipolarism vis-à-vis multilateralism. And the difference between the two kinds of models is that in the multilateralism we have common institutions. And in multilateral institution, we find an environment which is not made of so-called like-minded. In the same context, participate countries that are not on the same page on many issues. So I think this revisitation of the idea of international, of multilateralism vis-à-vis the international system as an arena of force is the main protagonist. I think should be recovered soon.
Thank you. Maurizio Montaldo.
Thank you, Roberto, for inviting me to this meeting. Important. I want to share with you some information because I am a lawyer, but I'm the editor of Italian version of World Water Report that World Water Assessment Program produce every year. And in the report, they approach numerous arguments. In 2018, for example, a World report about water, the argument was the nature-based solution. And they proposed to change the technology to use a different approach, use a different approach at the environment with and leave the technology funded the great technology and use a different philosophy to approach the environment and technology funded on an ecocentric vision. In 2019, the World Water Report, the argument of the World Water Report was the discrimination. The report explained how the poor pay water for rich, how the poor pay the water more than the rich. In 2020, the argument was the climate change and the politics to adaptation at climate change, and so on. And the argument of this year, of 2024, is prosperity and peace. So the United Nations indicate us some solution, and they propose to politics to use the report, the idea of the reports to build the future of the people of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Jason Nardi. Jason Nardi is not there, therefore we go on to Lucio Pascarelli. Lucio, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, please.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So I am one generation down from Roberto, who I've met about a year and a half ago. We started working on AI. I'm a son of a diplomat born in the US under Kennedy, grew up in Asia as a child, Burma, Indonesia, Japan, and India. And then I worked for 35 years for the United Nations, with the last 20 with various D roles. I'm not an optimist if I look at the future, because I see three major approaching storms, each of which could be obviously capable of disrupting world order. But if you put all three together, then obviously that is where my optimism is very low. I mean, the first one is obviously climate change. Climate change is unavoidable. The impact of climate change is unavoidable. I've been party to various UN conferences that touch the subject, and the fact that such an important problem is not being addressed by the UN. There's a fantastic chart that shows the rise of CO2 over the years, together with all the COP conferences, and it's quite obvious that all the COP conferences have zero impact on the rise of CO2. And, you know, working from the UN, within the UN, we used to say that if the United Nations does not exist today because the nations aren't united, and that is a fact. They are incapable of addressing such a serious problem. So that's one of the storms. The second storm that I think is approaching is obviously USA against China. I think Graham Allison describes it very well, and somebody before mentioned the situation there, which has to do with, again, the global south. The global south is not, I think, anymore the south if we look at India and China, because they have definitely risen from where they were 30, 40 years ago. But this conflict, which is in the news, or potential conflict, is a risk. And the third, of course, is technology. I mean, artificial intelligence is the thing that I think will have such a major impact on jobs more than anything else. And it's a general purpose technology. And the problem is that the transition or the impact potentially can happen in less than a generation. And other similar general purpose technologies have taken more generations to have an impact at the global level, but AI is having an impact quite rapidly at the global level, which will impact jobs. So, and if we focus on technology, again, I'm a technologist. My major activities have always been, as I call myself, a nerd. I worked with computers from when I was 14, which was back in the 70s. So I've seen many of these transitions. And I see clearly the current world order is based on whatever happened from a technological point of view between the two wars. The two wars, I think, were themselves instigated by technological advances. We went into World War II with biplanes. We came out with jets and the atomic bomb. By the way, I also believe that the veto at the Security Council makes sense because of atomic weapons, because without the veto, then I think some countries would have pulled out. We would have found ourselves back into a war and maybe not alive. I mean, I was very young in '63, but my parents do talk about the fact that whether they didn't know whether they're going to stay in Washington or move out during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And also I was back in the US in 68, 69 as a child. And I very well remember the duck cover and hide videos, which were shown at kindergarten. So, and I do know I had nightmares about missiles coming over the hill during my teen years. So I think technology is something that is what has caused a big change. Take India, for example. Internet has definitely had a major impact on the Indian GDP, because today more than 50% of the Indian GDP is because of services, which are possible because of the internet. On the other hand, we have AI, and although AI today is seen as something that only major economies can do, I don't think that's true at all. Yes, you do need some of the power that the US and China are putting into it, but the technology is available to anybody in the world. You don't need a major industrial or economic might to produce things with AI, to produce weapons or to produce useful or change, let's say, life-changing or impacts on society. Because the AI that we see today is done a lot thanks to open source technologies. And even on normal computers or things you can buy, you don't need huge cloud data centers, you can develop AI systems in a way similar as you can probably do already with genetic engineering. You know, you can buy a generic DNA splicing kit for $25,000 and do your own genetic engineering at home. So I think the technological impact that is going to happen in the coming years will probably shape the future and will shape how things go a lot more than it has done in the past. Again, when I was born, talking to somebody on the other side of the world, I remember in Burma, we used to have to book the phone call about 3 days in advance. Today, almost every human on the planet can, in real time, talk, send a WhatsApp message, or have a phone call or a video call with anybody else on the planet. And this is a major change that is, as I've seen in the UN and many of the discussions, is sometimes never properly understood on the impact that it is happening and is happening on younger generations. And one of the things I do, I teach metaverse at the Politecnico in Milano, and the new generations, there's 800 people, children or young people in the world that interact with each other on a daily basis. They're already very much globalized. They don't understand physical barriers or boundaries of countries. I think that's going to have an impact.
I'm sorry, you have to wait the next round. Thanks.
Next.
Now the floor goes to Professor Fezzini, who is in Paris.
Thank you. I'm very happy to discuss the fact that we do not consider enough Global South. And I think that even when we do it, we tend to do it in wrong manners. Sometimes we speak of how much beautiful we are, for example, that we are a garden and the rest is a jungle. Or sometimes we consider that the Global South doesn't exist. But I did a little exercise. I used the same argument that I use against the idea of Global South to the European Union in the first 10 years of its life. And I am sorry to announce you that we do not have the European Union, because if we adopt those criteria, it should not exist. So I decided to contribute to my first part by concentrating on some mechanism that we have, in other terms, a kind of Lacanian observation of what we have in mind. And I will start and conclude my first part by underlining 3 surprises that we, the West or Europe, had in the past. The first goes back to 2010. I was at the time the director of the OECD Development Center, and we produced a report that was called Shifting Wealth. And surprise, surprise, what was written there? It was written that the non-OECD country had already a GDP in PPP bigger than the OECD countries. We wrote that China was already the first partner in trade of Africa. And we wrote that there was a major middle class concentrating in developing countries where the rate of growth have been unprecedented. As a practice, I distributed the report to director in OECD, my colleague, to have their opinion before publication. And it was very surprising what I got. The answer were, no, what you are describing, this idea of a shift in the economic geography of the world, is not correct. It's just a phenomenon passing by. These are countries that are converging, and more or less will enter in the traditional perspective we have in mind. Respectable people, for example, one of my colleagues was Piercarlo Padoan in the economic department. So there was a big surprise and fundamentally a denial. Let me now move to the second example. The so-called Western countries were surprised and bewildered that so many and such strategic southern countries that they deemed allies did not support the UN resolution condemning Russia's aggression against Ukraine. It was a big surprise, the vote. So the question is, what misunderstanding lurked in the expectation of the Western countries? And why at the real and not the phantasmal state of the West and South relation remain invisible to many, despite several discordant signs? Let me give you a third example. 1 week before the invasion of Ukraine, there was the EU-Africa Union summit, headed by President Macron in one hand and President Macky Sall in the other hand. And the European wanted to have a final declaration writing down, we have a new alliance between Europe and Africa. And what the African answered? No thanks. No alliance. If you want, we can write a new partnership, but under the condition that is inclusive, you don't tell us who should be there, and is not exclusive. You don't come here to tell us that we cannot deal with China, for example. Now, these three surprises are, under my point of view, form of denial. What is extremely interesting for us about these surprises is that they are surprises not to be wasted. Why our lenses didn't see, and for many years continue not to want to see. And my point of view is that even now, we are rejecting to observe a series of changes that are there. I have 4 explanations, I don't think they are exhaustive, about this denial. But I will not tell you now, but in my next round, so that I hope you will wait for the second intervention. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now it should be my turn. I'm going to make an intervention which is not helpful. I am very pessimistic on the fact that in the next 5-10 years, there will be a design of some logic in the international relations. I think we are entering into a very serious crisis of disintegration, where there is a lack of identifying elements on which you can create some trends. I think this is affecting everywhere. It's a global issue, and therefore is also affecting the global south. I think that we have some elements into consideration today in the countries of the major part of the world. Foreign affairs have absolutely second plan. Internal problems, daily problems are extremely more important, and everything which you do with outside is relegated to a second concern. That is very strong, and politics is implementing and funding this kind of perception. The second is that the Washington Consensus, which in the 1986, 88, compounded by the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the arrival of the third wave of Tony Blair, number of issues, has created a situation where today, that we like or not, this culture of the market as the central element of society has pervaded every country and every strata of society. Today, the idea that man is at the center of the society is lost. Today, we all accept that the market is the center of our life. And this goes to some extreme, like how finance, delinked from economy, took an autonomous path and went into a different existence, to other factors for which we have no time here. But I have to say that this Washington consensus is still with us. The criteria on which we were during from the 89 until 2008, the crisis of Wall Street, trained to compete, greed is good, all this culture that came out during 20 years is still with us. And we have lost the value of solidarity, the value of tolerance, the value of number of values, which were together with development values. So this is a problem which, in my view, is making difficult to find lines of common policy, because to find common policy, unlike what Kissinger, the neorealist school, always said, interests are important, but they are short-term. Ideals are long-term. And today, we do not have any idea on which to work. Another point I want to make is that the decline of politics, in the quality of politics, in the quality of the system, is so evident everywhere. And as some of you, Federico, was saying, we do not have any longer a trend of democracy. Democracy are on the wane, and we will end this year, which is a very important electoral year, with a diminishment of democracy in the world. Now, I'm not here to defend democracy by itself, is another debate, but I want just to underline that governments which are not democratic are more despotic and take decisions more lonely than democracy. And you can see what happened in Sahel. The military government which came out took very dramatic decisions in a few weeks. And no democratic government could have done that. And this is going to continue everywhere. And therefore, this lack of democratic participation, which is the basis of multilateralism. Democracy is the basis of international law as element of international cooperation. Democracy is the basis of finding alliances on long term. This lack of democracy, in my view, is a very serious problem. And I would like to conclude with the elephant in the room, which is the arrival of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence at this moment is basically developed by two countries, China and the United States. These two countries are people who develop are people, human beings. Human beings have bias. If we take the software specialist of United States, they are white men, patriarchal, convinced that the United States an exceptional destiny. I mean, they have a number of things which are part of the American identity and culture. That's nothing to criticize. In fact, China is a totally different cultural model. Now, I am in Tegucigalpa, on Kivu. I am in an African country or in a Latin American or Asian country. Which is my model? As long as I take artificial intelligence, I am automatically getting into a cultural model of A or B. And this is a new problem of which no alignment or active no alignment would suppose that in the South we can develop alternative model with alternative cultural model who can express our identity, our reality. I put here now my Argentina hat. And I don't think this is going to happen. These models are coming and they have something new. They are global. They have no boundaries. They have no religion. They have no language. They are global. Platforms are global. And people enter into platform, enter into a virtual reality, and they get into that virtual reality that shapes them. So they become more and more individualistic, more and more atomized. And how can you bring global alternative ideas of vision and values if you don't have those tools? Those tools are commercial tools, are from the platform. There is a very brilliant book called The Techno-Feudalism, written by Vourakis, who says we are going back to feudalism because there will be few barons, who are the guy who has the platform, who will be immensely rich. Everybody will work for them because when we sit and we call Chapter we work. And we create work, we create wealth. And that goes to the people who want the platform. So there will be a world of barons with very weak emperors, like it was in the Middle Age. We go to feudalism, and it's a technical feudalism. Now, I see all these things as global trend, which tend to suffocate the ability of a global South to find its own path. And this global South is so intervened by Milei in Argentina, is a product of the Washington Consensus. And of course, it will never be in synchro with Lula in Brazil. And BRICS are subject to all this kind of problem which come from this global issue about I was talking, which I put Washington Consensus. So if we want to make Global South, we have to start to discuss about values of the South, like Boaventura was doing, that he was introducing a etymology of the South. We have to start to work on something of the identity, how this identity is different, and that is something that we have not done, and how this identity fits into a world of competition where we have competitors which are not only the big powers, China, India, and the United States, but we have a lot of regional competitors from Turkey to Indonesia. That this is becoming a world of multipolarism, not of multilateralism. And this means that we have to do a lot of work. And I don't see in this moment, in what we are doing in the South, this global work. So I'm sorry if this intervention is not helpful, but I see things in this perspective. So I apologize and I give the floor to Juan Somavia, who is much more competent than me on this issue, and I hope he will address the fluency of the meeting. Juan? What happens? Juan is not here.
Yeah, I don't think I didn't
Whatever is.
I think Juan is not connected.
Okay, then if Juan has left, we go to Monsignor Yamengo with the last in alphabetic order, which does not mean that he's the last, but he was born with a name and he carries that reality.
Yes, thank you very much. I think, oh, yeah, yes, thank you very much. I hope to be the last but not the least. Thank you to Franco Dinali. You permit me to be here. I want to share a little ideas about poverty, conflict, instability in Africa and global South, and to introduce a concept not to balance the techno-feudalism, but to create also hope for new, to create hope. We are living at a crucial moment for humanity in which peace seems to give way to war, conflict are growing, and stability is increasingly at risk. It was the word of Pope Francis addressing the Security Council of the United Nations last June. He also denounced ideological colonization whereby wealthier, more powerful countries attempt to impose their own worldview on poorer countries. I recall Abdurrahman Sissako film Bamako, and he put the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in an improbable fiction trial using cinema as a vehicle for representing injustice. In his film Bamako, a documentary fiction denouncing the hypocrisy of the so-called North vis-à-vis del South and our wealthy Western states, and international financial institution has imposed a very specific desperateness on Africa with structural adjustment programs and debt burdens. Multilateralism is generally understood to mean an alternative to the unilateral domination of global affairs by one or more superpowers. I call also the two encyclical letters of Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, encouraging multilateralism through the promotion of fraternity and social friendship, and Laudato Si, recommending the safeguarding of our common home. And after, I can say Ubuntu, the African concept in geopolitics, represent also the two encyclical letters of Pope Francis. And Ubuntu is pleading for a world where relationship will no longer be based on domination and exploitation, and where there will no longer be brutality and violence. The international community must maintain the universality of global multilateral forums and not turn them into clubs reserved for a few elites, highlighting dialogue, shared responsibility, and cooperation as key word for effective multilateralism in the pursuit of the common good. And now I recall the presence of the Minister of External Affairs of India in the last summit of BRICS in South Africa. And the theme of this summit was BRICS and Africa Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development, and Inclusive Multilateralism. And he said, in many ways, the spirit of Ubuntu shapes the activities and evolution of the BRICS grouping. The message of I am because of you, I am because you are, expresses the interdependence of our globalized existence, which has brought the BRICS nation together. And ultimately, I want to recall Ubuntu and storytelling, because the new battle space now is our connected world and the connected space. Can we construct together an Ubuntu algorithm? Ubuntu spirit is pushing toward using narratives for construction of knowledge and shared meaning sense among all for serene understanding of the past, present and inclusive sharing, and for shaping a common future. The propaganda and the weaponization of storytelling, we must do everything to avoid this thing. The first thing we need to battle with is the polarized speech, the hate speech, and also in this way, education for a global compact is really the project of Pope Francis, and we are with Ubuntu, with this education for global compact, we hope we can build a better world for all.
Now I must repair a mistake that I made because of my old age. I didn't see Ambassador Vento, and I apologize with him. It is around now. Ambassador Vento, do you want to speak now or you go?
I appreciate I've been included in this panel today, and I would like just to deliver a very few comments. First is that the very fact that the globalization is the object of criticism coming from the West in the United States, where globalization in the 90s was launched on the wave of euphoria for the end of the Cold War. Well, in my view, the fact that globalization is going to be sidelined to a certain extent by the West reveals that it has been a successful outcome for the South of the world. And commercial surpluses are there to show that how the share of the South in the world trade rose from 15 to about 35% over the last 20 years, as well as also the fact that the share of the GDP by the G7 has dropped over the last 20 years from 70 to 55% or less even. When for those who have started their experience, professional experience, in my case, as a junior diplomat, my first professional experience was with the launch of UNCTAD in 1964, at the initiative of a glorious Argentinian economist, Raul Prebisch, belonging to this Santiago Economic School for Development, and thinking how in UNCTAD doctrine, trade was always the key for development, or let's say was the main key for a redistribution of the world wealth among the different geographic area, is a great satisfaction. Now, among the most interesting things I heard today in our meeting was the distinction, the proper distinction, which has been made between multipolar system and a multilateral system. multipolar system is a reality arising from, let's say, I would say the wealth of the nations, the dynamism, the governance of a number of countries belonging to the global south, namely, while the multilateral system we know is a working method, is a working approach with its architecture, its institutions, its rules, its contradictions, as a matter of fact. Now, the multipolar world, to a large extent, has developed over the last 25 years on the wings, let me say, of the WTO. Strange destiny, the one of the WTO. It was heavily attacked. You will remember in Seattle in 1999, the turbulence which had addressed the WTO as a body which was the, let's say, the new face of the old new face of capitalism, aggressive capitalism, of salary reductions, the share of salaries and wages in the Western economy, in the industrialized economy, looking for markets where a number of constraints, social, environmental, and other nature, were reduced. Well, now the WTO also is the object of criticism from the West, mostly from the United States, less by European Union, but to a certain extent, we see that some kind of unease of European countries towards some trade developments has appeared also in the talks of the last few hours in Paris between President Macron, Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, and Chinese President Xi. Well, I come to a conclusion. Must say that in the case of European Union, we have met a rather disappointing record in the ability to differentiate itself from the United States, as a matter of fact, across the Atlantic. Take the case for Africa. Europe, I heard over the last few years to speak about the Chinese debt trap. That is rather ridiculous. I mean, the mediocrity of this kind of definition. Talking about debt traps by China, yes, maybe there are some situations, some conditions where Chinese conditions may be rather, how to say, difficult to meet by the African countries. But when we are addressing the issue of debt, I think that the West, as such, it has a very punishing record toward developing countries. And again, when we have heard in Europe kind of panic about Chinese presence, growing Chinese presence in Africa, well, the European attitude toward Africa, and we know that Europe has very heavy responsibilities toward Africa, as a matter of fact, well, let's not forget that the void of European policies toward Africa has been filled. Politics, like physics, cannot tolerate void. And China shown in the field of infrastructures and a number of other areas of intervention to have the ability and the capacity to fill the gap. Thank you.
Ambassador, I'm sorry, your time is out.
He said thank you.
Okay, thanks. So thanks a lot. And now the last speaker is Khalid, who does not necessarily need to answer to everybody, but he has 4 minutes at his disposal.
First of all, thank you. Wonderful comments and very insightful points of view. Let me highlight 4 or 5 quick points. One is, like it or not, the speed of change is very dramatic. The rise of the South, as Jorge and others have also said, is here to stay. It's not going to change, but it's going to intensify. In the late 1990s, the trade between Africa and China was $2 billion only. In the 2000s, 10 years plus, it got to $200 billion. And now it's probably $500 billion. So the rate of change is quite dramatic. I was giving a lecture at New York University on China-Africa, and I was really interested to know that how negative people in the West saw the rise of China. China is now the largest trade, investment, aid partner in almost every country in Africa, bar none. But no one expected China to be the largest trading partner of Latin America, of India even, of South Asia. Change is very rapid, and we have to just accept not only the South is here to stay, the global South is transforming itself very rapidly. And one aspect of this rapid transformation is in diplomacy, in peace building. Who expected China to play a role in bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together for peace? No one expected it. So the stimulus for peacemaking cannot be held by 1 or 2 countries. In fact, there's been a lot of criticism in Gaza that not many people are being allowed to play a serious diplomatic role because of sudden dominance of certain groups. I very much appreciated Federico Maio's comment about governance. We have to fix governance at the global level. And frankly, I see there's an opportunity now because of the rise of the global South, because power is being dispersed. And it requires leadership and people in the civil society coming together and say, let us shape things. It's an opportunity now. This is why I was very grateful for Roberto to bring us together, because we cannot miss this opportunity. You know, you can either, force of history are pushing us forward, like it or not, but do we have the ability, the interest, the commitment to seize it and try to transfer it to a more productive route? I very much like this whole idea of multilateralism versus multipolarization. We have to push the multipolar word into a multilateral word. And unfortunately, it cannot be done by only building up blocks here and there. It just cannot be done. The G20 idea, which actually Joe Stiglitz, my friend Joe Stiglitz started, was meant to be housed in the UN. And at the very last moment, if you remember, President Bush took the decision to take it outside the UN. So these are the realities we have to confront. Because power is being dispersed, not just with China, or with India, or with Brazil, or with Indonesia. I can go on, a lot of countries are playing a much larger role. In Africa, we have to find a way to bring a coalition of people, of countries together to recreate. You know, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, a good friend, has highlighted the need to reform the financial architecture of the world, the Bretton Woods institutions. Why? Because we are, as Roberto has highlighted, we are stuck with a development agenda which has been heavily influenced by the Washington Consensus. We have to find a way to come out of it. As my friend Moshahid Hussain would witness, he's been fighting this good fight in Pakistan for a long time. Pakistan is one of the biggest victims of the Washington Consensus. Pakistan is a very interesting country. It is a 240 million people country, but it's being driven by 500,000 people who think they live in America or Europe, but somehow not addressing the needs of the people in Pakistan. We have to find a way to make the agenda more pro-people, pro-poor, and pro-environment. We have to find a way, and I think there's an opportunity to do exactly that with the rise of the global south.
Well, thank you. Now, the gatekeeper has to make an observation. I left the people were, let's just say, with a very enthusiastic contribution, speak a little bit more than the 4 minutes. In fact, practically, I think everybody spoke how much as he wanted, and nobody really spoke 4 minutes. The situation now is the following. We have 19 participants. If 19 participants speak 4 minutes, to round up, let's just say that we have 80 minutes. 80 minutes, according to the basic arithmetic, is 1 hour and 20 minutes. Now, from 4:15 to reach here, we took, instead of 1 hour and 10 minutes, 2 hours and 5 minutes. If you want to again repeat the same performance in the second round, but we have a problem with we have organized for the people who are here a kind of dinner, and food will be difficult to eat after a certain time. So we should try to finish, if not at 7:30 as originally planned, let's just say at 8. That means that if we speak each of us 4 minutes, at this 1 hour and 20 minutes, being 6:22 plus 1 hour, we are at 7:44. Khalid will have to say a few words after this, and this brings us at 8 o'clock. Can we speak each of us 4 minutes? That is my question.
3 minutes.
If we are confident that we can speak each of us 4 minutes, then I don't see problem to keep the schedule. Now, the first speaker is Akamphora.
No, thank you. I will be very, very short. Just some comments because I'm here for listening and learning. So I don't have very brilliant comments to do. But just something that is very connected to my job. I teach at university, and I see the point that Federico Mayor said before about the main aim that we need probably in our current times, that is exactly educating people. That is a political aim for me. And so I work in an educational system, and I have a very pessimistic view about the possibility to solve the problem educating people. And I want to use also to point out exactly the point that you mentioned before in the first speech, in your first speech, that was exactly to try to use to the linguistic level, to try to use the right and the useful categories for understanding reality. And for instance, when we use the expression global south and non-alignment in our educational system, we're talking about a Cold War at all, okay? And as you perfectly know, Cold War was a completely different historical context than now. It was based on the confrontation, strong confrontation between two different ways of life, two different views of state, man, societies, God, and history, and societies, of course. And I think it's something that is completely different than now. And two different ideas of futures. And as Cecilia said before, probably the main problem that we have now and about our young generations is that there is no idea of future at all. And that's a very, very, and it's not only for the climate change. The climate change is probably the most important problems, but not the only one. For instance, just an example, when we talk about, I teach history, and when I talk about non-alignment and the Global South, I talk about a minor history, and a meaningfully minor history. And we remain, I think in our educational system, we remain essentially in sort of a, I think Pezzini said something very similar before. We remain essentially in a sort of Eurocentric perspective, a self-centered perspective. I repeat, I teach contemporary history, and I see that me and my colleagues and the books that we use generally deal with the global history again and again in a Euro-Western perspective. This is a problem for our students, I mean, because they don't know anything about what Asia is, for instance. They have just a general and often very wrong idea about the global South. For instance, just we have a problem, they have a problem to show in a map where India is, okay, where Israel or Syria are. Just a very, very short anecdote. Some years ago, a student told me that India was very, very close to the Italian borders. Just to have an idea. That's silly, it might be. Oh, probably. I think he intended in a geographical means. So, just a final comment. My impression is that we don't have the educational means to build or to form an open, uniting society. That is our main aim.
Thank you. Now the floor goes to Oscar Arias.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. I don't really know if I am the only politician in this group. But for those who don't know me, I come from a country, Costa Rica, with 75 years of no army. And I have been president of this country twice, one in the 80s, when there were plenty of conflicts, military conflicts in the region. And I introduced a peace plan against the will of the two superpowers of the time, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev and Fidel Castro. And after a lot of work, trying to persuade the whole world to support a negotiated solution, the peace plan was signed by the 5 Central American presidents, and we were able to pacify the region. One of the most important points in my peace plan was to make of the region the first demilitarized zone in the world. And that obviously didn't succeed. None of my colleagues agreed with me. So I got a little bit disappointed, but at least we brought peace to the region. So I decided to try with Panama. Panama had been bombed by President Bush in December of 1989. And at the end of my term in 1990, I told the new president who had been sworn in the Panama Canal zone by the US Marines, since nobody in Latin America wants to establish diplomatic relations with you, I would like to recognize you, but under one condition, if we get rid of the Panamanian army. And after a lot of work, trying to persuade the Panamanian people that this was a good idea, we did it. So very few people know that the safest border in the world is that between Costa Rica and Panama, two countries without an army. Then a few years later, I did the same with Haiti and President Aristide, and we were able to get rid of the Haitian army, but not constitutionally as we did in Panama. So, as you all know, a few years later, it was created again by the Americans. Then I decided something more challenging, and that was to travel to sub-Saharan Africa. I held a conference with presidents and prime ministers and defense ministers organized by the Arias Foundation for Peace in order to try to persuade many governments to get rid of the armies, or at least to cut military spending, demilitarize their countries. I obviously didn't succeed in getting rid of any army, persuading any president or prime minister. But at least some governments cut their defense spending. But I also wanted to do something besides dealing with domestic issues for the world. So after a few years, we drafted the Arms Trade Treaty. Originally, it was a code of conduct on arms transfers. Later on, it became a treaty, and it was supported by many NGOs and governments. And to make a long story short, when I became president again in 2006, I sent the ATT to Ban Ki-moon, and in 2013, it was approved by the General Assembly. I also tried to persuade the IMF and the World Bank to accept what I call the Costa Rica Consensus. It was a formula by which the World Bank and the IMF should not forgive debts to developing countries if they were spending more on defense than in education, healthcare, and the protection of the environment. Obviously, this didn't succeed. It was an idea whose time hasn't come. I agree with some of you who have pointed out that the main problem is our value system. With our values in the 21st century, we cannot succeed in abolishing poverty, inequality, and building a better world for humanity. It is quite irresponsible for the world to spend so much money in arms and soldiers. 14 times more than in cooperation, 15 times more than in cooperation. And my advice to you is that don't listen to speeches of presidents or prime ministers. Look at the budgets. Look how much they spend on defense and how much they spend on protecting the environment, on infrastructure, on healthcare, on education, on culture, on reducing poverty, on reducing inequality, etc., etc. Just look at the budgets. And I believe that the Bretton Woods institutions and should use both carrots as well as punishments. But we should, most of you who are university professors and intellectuals, we need to think of creating carrots in order to persuade poor governments to cut military spending. That shouldn't be a priority. But it is a priority simply because the values are wrong. And if the values are wrong, then the decisions are wrong. Then the actions are wrong. The actions taken by governments. Now, what is Europe doing to tell the Americans, don't push us to spend more on the military, to spend 2% of GDP for NATO members? What the hell are we doing to stop that nonsense? It is stupid. It is quite stupid. Why don't we learn how to rely more on trying to prevent conflicts first? And if a conflict emerges, to bring the parties in conflict to the negotiating table, as I did in the 80s. But no one is trying really hard to do that. No one. I have tried to send an article to the op-ed of the New York Times suggesting precisely that. It wasn't published. I also wrote a longer piece for Foreign Affairs. It wasn't published. The mainstream media in the West, in Europe, in the US, is in favor of the war, in favor of supplying more weapons to the Ukrainians. I believe that Biden is convinced that he needs to win the war in Ukraine in order to win the election in November. And his support to Netanyahu is just incredible. It's just incredible. Nobody is saying anything about that. But the US keeps sending a few cents to humanitarian aid to the Palestinians and billions of dollars to Prime Minister Netanyahu. That's not right, and we need to speak out and criticize that. Is he really the leader of the world, of the free world? My God, with such leadership, we won't be able to build a better world. So I don't want to speak more than 4 minutes, but I honestly believe that we're not doing our job. We need to speak out. We need to be more critical, and we need to understand that to govern is to choose. And if we choose arms and soldiers instead of the satisfaction of the basic needs of society, we are simply not doing the right thing.
Okay, Oscar, thanks a lot. And I hope you will have time for a third round.
I said everything I had to say.
Antonio.
Thank you, Roberto. I hope that we have more time to discuss this issue, so I think that time is running really short. Well, you know, I'm not a militant on many of the issues, so I take an approach which is more pragmatic, and frankly speaking, I don't think that we should be worried because China and India are successful from an economic point of view. It's good. I mean, we have been discussing for decades on how to support development in the world. So the fact that there are success stories is very good. The point is, of course, it's a matter of rules. I think that Ambassador Vento was recalling the WTO matters. I've seen the entrance of China in WTO. I remember that all the dispute settlement was created on the basis of the 301 of the United States, but we have seen that after what's happened. I mean, we in Italy destroyed completely our small and medium enterprise industry in textiles and shoemaking. We have seen that the rules have been interpreted in a certain way, and now we have a problem to cope with the new situation with the rules that have been adopted in a different period of time. But still, I think that we need to be a little bit more granular in looking at the situation. We have the situation of middle income countries, no one has mentioned, but this is a problem in the international community that still remains. It's an economic and a political problem that has to be look at it and try to find a solution. And then we have the real South, the continuation of the problems regarding the poor countries. So that's why I think that when we refer to the Global South, I prefer to be more granular. I'm happy that countries have been having success, but I still think that we need to focus on countries that will require a lot of attention. Now, I think that G7, G20, and United Nations have been mentioned. You mentioned the Americans didn't want the G20, but I remember that many countries at the UN didn't want to hear about G20. Let's not forget that the mentality at the UN is completely different. The idea that the UN has to fix everything has been always there since ever. The reality now is that we have these processes where countries are able to move the agenda, and then UN can benefit from this modality of moving the agenda. We need, I think, to concentrate on what has been the big success of the UN, which has been the SDGs agenda. This has been a big success. It has set up the parameters for the world in order to make progress. We have not to forget this, because this is a unifying agenda. No one is challenging this agenda, and this is the starting point for continuing to cooperate among all countries. We are confronted with the major challenges. We need to change the world, and we need to change it in a short period of time. No one in the past has done this, and we need to do this for the first time. So it's a big challenge for the new generation. And in order to start this big task, we need to create some consensus. Unfortunately, for the security matters, the situation is very far from being fixed. But on these issues regarding development and climate change, the possibility to make progress is there, and there are grounds for discussing with countries even where we might think we are a little bit far away, but on climate change we discuss with Chinese, we discuss with India, we discuss with many countries. So the possibility is there to start recreating a positive agenda to reinforce a multilateral system.
Thank you. Now we go to Ingeborg, and I make a very illegitimate act of my power to take this opportunity to congratulate you for your book on peace, which is the Encyclopedia Britannica of the books of peace. Please.
Thank you. With my dear former boss, Federico Mayor, and Oscar Arias Nobel Peace Prize laureate around the table, I actually don't need to say much. I just want to echo what Federico insists on, that we have to implement the ideals of the UN and the ideals of UNESCO and use peace education in its broadest sense as a vehicle. But when times are dark as now, and I feel that most of us here are quite pessimistic, we need to search for inspiration and for ways of doing this. How do we take over the narratives from the hawks in the East and the West? And I think honestly that we have to confront NATO, the world's biggest military alliance ever. And paragraph 5, which is a lot spoken about, is of no interest to me, because I think that if NATO is coming to help the country, it will be devastated. It will be nothing left afterwards. So for me, paragraph 13 of NATO is the most important. It says that if you have been a member for a year, you can leave the organization by informing the government of the United States, who will then inform the others. It says everything about NATO. So NATO is now being globalized and is definitely a threat to the strength of the UN. So where to find inspiration for the peace movement? Costa Rica is almost the only example that we have of a country that has managed to demilitarize, and who on the international scene is the one who always can be counted on for helping to bring forward the ideals of peace. I mean, Costa Rica was the one who negotiated the Declaration on the Right to Peace, the UN anti-nuclear treaty. So, but are there others? I'm thinking about South Africa, that they took the spirit of Nelson Mandela to heart when they took Israel to the International Court of Justice. It was very courageous of them, but Biden is certainly not Kennedy. Putin is not Gorbachev. Scholz is not Willy Brandt. And in the Nordic countries, we don't have any Olaf Palme for the time being. So do we need to go back to Mahatma Gandhi to get the vision of how to work in without violence? Imagine that he managed without violence to get India the jewel of the imperial crown out of the British Empire. So I had hoped that you would tell us about leaders in the South, upcoming leaders that could take on the strength that we saw from previous leaders that I don't see anymore. So that is all that I wanted to say right now, and that is demilitarize, and like Oscar Arias is saying, follow the money and not what they are saying, because the double standards are well, they are becoming more visible in the way that we see how the West reacted immediately to Russia with sanctions and iron curtains and non-cooperation, whilst there are no specific steps taken to stop the genocide in Gaza. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, we now go to Bo. Bo?
Oh. Well, I think that we have been dissecting a corpse. I think that there is a sense in this group that the global north is not on the top anymore. And we should be aware of the fact that there is global south because there was a global north. And when the global north was on the top, we were very happy with zero-sum game. But now that the global north is not on the top, we want positive sum game. Well, the north is always looking into the future, and because they don't want to remember. But the global south cannot forget what colonialism was and what all the grievances were. And therefore, I think that we are theoretically and politically exhausted in the global north. And for that reason, I think that the two issues are both epistemological, and I appreciate very much what Mario Pezzini said. Our problem is the knowledge with which we are analyzing these issues, because we are still trusting certain kinds of knowledge, academic knowledge, university knowledge, and we don't look at non-vernacular knowledges, popular knowledges that exist in our society. Our peasants, our indigenous people, our young people, you know, our knowledge is really a valid knowledge. Scientific knowledge is a valid knowledge, but is not the only one valid knowledge. There are other valid knowledge. So that's why I focus so much on epistemological issues. The second one is the question of ethics. Of course, I think the values we have to, and that's for me the most dramatic change, is that the North has been teaching the South for 5 centuries, and now the North must learn from the South. And it's not easy, because we are not used to be taught by the global South, and we don't have the terms for that. Look, the two new concepts here were Ubuntu, coming from Southern Africa, and the Summa Causae, or good living, from the Quechua people in Latin America. They are both alternative to development. But when we talk about success of the global South, we talk about trillions of dollars. So always the same model. I mean, the same type. Do we have to have alternatives to development, not just alternative development? We want to be fair to Mother Nature. I mean, Luigi Ferrajoli, a great constitutionalist in Italy, is now proposing the Earth's constitution. That is to say, I have been proposing the rights of nature. And I think that we have to include, for the global North, it is impossible to conceive of the rights of nature. But nature has rights. And we have to accept that. For the indigenous people in Africa, or for the Africans, or for the indigenous people, or for the Asians, this is not a problem. For us, it is a problem. So I think that we have to change our minds, and therefore there is an epistemological and an ethical issue at the core of our ideas. And to conclude, the reason why we are here is that most people of the world have too much fear and very little hope that anything better can come. And I think that we have to follow Spinoza, that we need an equilibrium between fear and hope. But in order to give hope to the people, we have to also give fear to the billionaires, to the plutocrats. And our critical thinking and theories, they are not afraid of us anymore, because they have really, and now with artificial intelligence, they think that they have solved all the enemies, but they buy everything. So is artificial intelligence an utopia or a dystopia? We don't know. Maybe both. Probably it is both. But we know we have not the power to gear. And we know that most of innovation in the North has come from wars. And the next war may be a global war, annihilating most of nature and of us. So I think the stakes are very high. And I think that this meeting for me has been very clarifying, that in fact we are getting at the core issues, but we are thinking about the new with old concepts. And with concepts, we don't get anywhere, because the South don't trust us anymore. I mean, I've been in Africa and Asia, and when we talk about rules-based international relations, you know, they smile at us. Well, what is that? Rules-based, you know, whenever it is convenient to the North. When it is not convenient, it's just war. So I think that we have really start learning, and our universities should really try to engage with the university. I'm not saying that the Global South is always South in epistemic terms. There are many people in the South that think just precise like the people in the North. But there are other realities there. And I think that we should be aware of those. And this for me is an eye-opening meeting to change our values, to change our, and it is possible. As Oscar Arias has shown, it is possible if there is the political will. And there is no political will because we have a political problem at the core of our problems. And the problem is epistemological and ethical. So that's basically what I have to say. And I think that's been marvelous, this meeting, for us to try to learn from the South. Be humble, humble, humble. That's the key.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
You have always a syllogistic way which is very difficult to interrupt. Then now is the time for Cecilia Capanna.
I will be very brief. Basically, I'm optimist because the problem contains the solution usually. And multipolarism versus multilateralism is something that it can be solved reinforcing democracy because multilateralism is based on democracy and we have a lack of democracy now. Democracy is declining and politics are declining because as my mentor Roberto Savio said, Washington consensus has replaced the citizen from the center of the interests of politics with financial interests. And also trade is the core of the problem, is a key of the problem. And due to Washington consensus, there are no rules. And trades are fragmented, highly fragmented. And so what is needed to me is a common trading rule system. And it's not me saying that, by what I heard from very important people, this is what is needed just as a start. Then about education, I disagree with you because if the kids, and I'm a teacher, and I teach in an international high school now, with Chinese, Russian, Indonesian, any kind of Nigerian students. And I had to face a little bit, pretty many problems at the beginning because they were arguing. So if they are like this, it's because of us. So you cannot blame children because they are like this, because we are the older generation, so it's not also the system. We have to change the system. So if we are at the basis, and I am in the basis, I'm not at your level, here I'm very practical at basis. I am teaching to democracy by trying to see things from different perspectives, which is the solution to see the entire object. If you are just seeing a thing from one perspective, you will never be able to see what is on the other side. So I think that this is what we have to do to reinforce democracy. Thank you. Sorry for being long.
Thank you. Franco Dinelli.
Okay, I really appreciated all the interventions. So I only stress those who are closer to my feelings. For instance, I do appreciate what Ingeborg said about NATO. The last intervention of Boa is fantastic. And the analysis of Pezzini, I appreciate Vento, ambassador, who stressed the fact that it's actually the intention of Italian jurists is to bring down the system which the Western countries constructed to increase the depth of the developing countries. To finish with a positive note, I fully agree with Khalid and also with Cecilia. I'm not pessimist. It depends really on what we do, and I do appreciate what Arias Oscar said about the values. We have to stress on the values. We have to work on as Paolo and Cecilia mentioned, the education, that what I do believe it's very important, enforcing democracy, enforcing respect of the others. So in the end, I want just to stress that this concept of Ubuntu that Monsignor Janvier expressed is something we have to look after. And Italy, because I live in Italy, Italy must change completely the approach. We really need to start from the basis. But I think people want to change the system. We have to work in order to have better politicians. We have to work in order to change the system from the law. Until we don't reach the parliament, we are basically with no force to change the system. Thanks.
Thanks. Now is the turn of Jorge Aine.
Sorry?
Jorge Camin.
Yes, thank you. The first point I would like to...
Button for the speaker.
The first point I would like to emphasize is the significance of what is happening or not happening in Gaza. What we are seeing...
You're not speaking. Now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sure. About what is happening in Gaza. 34,000 people killed, 14,000 children. More children have died in Gaza in the past 7 months than in all wars in the whole world in the past 4 years. Yet there is no reaction on the so-called rules-based system on this. The war continues, and it will get a lot worse before it gets better. In my view, what we are seeing in Gaza puts paid to the notion that the West stands for the defense of human rights. It does not. It only stands for the defense of human rights when those involved are Europeans or people that look like Europeans. That is why the difference on the reaction of what is happening in Ukraine and what is happening in Gaza. Ukrainians are Europeans, Palestinians are not. And that has gone down very bad in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, where there has been a very strong reaction. You might have seen Colombia just broke diplomatic relations with Israel. Other countries did it before, Bolivia, Belize. So that, it seems to me, is a real turning point. The second point I would like to emphasize is that what we have seen in the world today, hand in hand with the rise of the Global South, is the emergence of what we have called, in a new book that has come out, active non-alignment. That is a movement that takes a page from the non-alignment movement of the 50s and 60s, but adapts it to the realities of the 21st century, realities that show a very different Global South, what used to be called the Third World, than in the 20th century. One that is much stronger, one that has economic power, one that is able to do things that countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America were not able to do in the 20th century. Active non-alignment stands for countries in the developing world taking their own national interests in their hands, not let themselves be pushed around by the big powers, by the great powers, and imposing and establishing their own priorities. In that sense, active non-alignment is very much the way of the future. It originally arose in Latin America in 2019, 2020, when Latin America was being put between a rock and a hard place by Washington and by Beijing. We had the pandemic, and at the same time, we were being pressured, both by the United States and by China, to take stances on a number of issues, putting us in a very difficult situation. Out of that arose our proposal for active non-alignment, which we published in late 21. And with the war in Ukraine, as I said earlier, and BRICS expansion and the war on Gaza, this transcended Latin America and has now become a much broader notion. The book was released in New Delhi by the Indian Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, last year, and has led to a very significant debate around the world on how active non-alignment is very much what developing nations need to embrace. The third point I would like to emphasize is that when people ask, is there a practical application of this? Is any country that's actually doing this? I will say yes. We have now Brazil under President Lula that is de facto applying this notion. Celso Amorim, his foreign minister, and now Chief Foreign Affairs Advisor, has a chapter, the final chapter in our book. And you might have seen, and somebody asked earlier, where the significant leaders of the global South are today. We have, of course, President Oscar Arias here in this webinar, which is a great honor and privilege. But let me also emphasize that the role that President Lula is playing in today's world must also be stressed. He, despite the many problems that domestic problems that Brazil has, he took the initiative to bring an attempt to bring a peaceful solution to what is happening in Ukraine. He has also been very vocal in denouncing what is happening in Gaza. He called the first South American summit in 8 years. We had not had a South American presidential summit in 8 years, and he called it himself. He called the first presidential summit on the Amazon, and I think in 10 years as well. Brazil, of course, as you know, is now chairing the G20, and is bringing a very important agenda to the G20. Brazil will also be chairing the COP30 next year. So I would like to stress that Brazil, under President Lula, is very much putting the notion and the doctrine of active non-alignment front and center, and it is really resonating in Latin America and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Now is the time of Usaid Mushaid.
Thank you. I think it's been a riveting debate and a very intellectually stimulating discussion on different aspects. I'll just be very short. I think the 2 points which have been made by earlier learned speakers I'd just like to pick up. One, I think Mr. Federico Mayor rightly hit the nail on the head when he mentioned President Eisenhower's famous speech of 17th January 61 about the military-industrial complex, which has now become a permanent war machine and dominating the American system and the American foreign policy. And the second point just made by Mr. Jorge Hein about the so-called rules-based order and its collapse in the rubble of Gaza, where double standards of the West have shown. I think it's very clear now that the principal contradiction as we see it is between the global North and the global South. And the view is that the global North is in decline and the global South is resurgent. And that's why in the three big conflicts that we face in the world today, Ukraine, Gaza, and the new Cold War spawned by Washington's military-industrial complex, the global South is no longer aligned with the global North. And there is this yawning chasm, which is really expanding. So in this context, I still am an optimist. I feel that come November 5th, you will see the re-election of President Trump. Whatever may be the failings of Trump, one thing is clear, that you will have a president presiding over a weak, divided, and inward-looking America who will be less militaristic in American foreign policy. And that would be the key to change, because this militarization of international relations under the American security establishment, under the American deep state, under the American military-industrial complex, which is also putting pressure on Europe. And I'm glad that people like Macron are standing up and talking of strategic autonomy in Europe. And there are shades of de Gaulle in his thinking, and others also are speaking up. That would make the difference. But I think we are seeing the unfolding of a new global order. And I think Khalid Malik was right when he said that the Washington consensus used to drive all those policies which were anti-people. My own country is witness to that. We have had 23 occasions to go to the IMF, which in my view is a tried, tested, and failed formula. And I feel that a lot of countries feel that connectivity, regional cooperation, the Belt and Road Initiative led by China, and working together on issues like climate change and also on moving forward on economy, energy, ports, pipelines, roads, and railways. That is the future, not a very militaristic, divisive, security-centered global worldview, which is still being peddled by Washington and which is based on the old playbook which they had against the Soviet Union in the Cold War days. China is not a Soviet Union. It's a different world altogether. And I'm quite optimistic that I think events are leading inexorably in that direction. And I hope that President Trump is elected. He will be a better president of foreign policy than Biden and the others who are part of the American security establishment. So on that note, I'll close my remarks, and I must thank my good friend, Dr. Roberto Savio, for taking this timely initiative, and for Mr. Khalid Malik, who has a great experience both in the East and the West, for setting the framework for this outstanding discussion and debate, which I hope is being transcribed so we can learn from it in print as well. Thank you so much, and greetings from Islamabad and good night from Islamabad. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Now is Ambassador Ferrara.
I'll be very brief. So I must say that I'm not fond of broad category. So if you want to use Global South, you are most welcome. But then you have to show me what Burkina Faso and Vietnam have in common, and Egypt or Ecuador, for instance. So I think we need to be more respectful of national identity in different regions. And to my understanding, the very notion of Global South is not entirely decolonized concept. So, because we are conflating many different reality, using us as the West as the point of reference. And also the West is problematic because, for instance, now Russia is calling the West the collective West. So it's not only the Euro-Atlantic world. And to one Russian ambassador I was talking to the other day, I asked, so what do you mean? And they said, well, you the West and Japan. To what extent Japan belongs to the West? So, I mean, it's an ideological political notion that we can accept, of course, but I do not believe in this kind of cleavage. So they are not helpful. I did not believe in the clash of civilization. At that time, I do not believe in this new clash of civilizational states, India, Russia, or even Brazil, bringing a new different vision of the world. I think that we have to put all these perspectives together in order to get somewhere. And finally, it's very simplistic to see that to say that one side there is the loyalism in international relations, and then you have the revisionist. In my opinion, there are three possible ways of exerting power in international arena. Either you are a constituting power, so trying to create a framework, treaty, point of reference that belongs to everyone, or you are an instituting power, creating institution, common institution for the global governance, or it also legitimates to be a destituting power, a power that in a legitimate way does some fundamental contestation of the order. But you should not lose sight of the fact that at the end of the world, this attitude is really zero-sum. So I think to have a war when there is a distribution, a net distribution of wealth, a net distribution of power, I think it is not helpful, it is not realistic today. So, and one final word, of course, I very much appreciate, Monsignor, the mention of Fratelli Tutti as an encyclical of love, Ubuntu, and said, but I have some problem in associating that with BRICS as such. So,
okay, thanks. Federico Mayor. Federico, are you with us? I think Federico's left. Well, then if not Federico Mayor, we go to Maurizio Montaldo.
He passes. Go to the next one.
Copy. Okay. Okay, then we go to Lucio Pascarelli.
Yes, thank you. I'll be brief. Again, I'll try to bring a bit of a technological perspective, which is what I can do. Getting back to AI, I think it's hard to predict the future, but it's clear that it will have a massive impact on the economies of many countries. And if I give again, for example, India, again, India today has turned into the economy it is thanks to the internet, thanks to its services sector, because it speaks English and because it is connected, and therefore you can outsource a lot of jobs to India. However, the kind of jobs, the kind of activities that are done in India are very much the activities that can be taken over by AI. And so for the reason why we have offshore jobs to India, because of the lower cost of human resources, they're probably going to be taken back and put into the cloud, because that again would be cheaper. And if something like that happens, then again, you're going to have a massive disruption of what of the Indian economy. And I'm giving India as an example, but the same can apply to many other countries that have taken advantage of the internet to bring economy to their countries. The fact that China is taking over Africa in many ways and has greatly expanded the trade is again due to the fact that China has become the Manchester of the world today, and therefore it needs to feed its industrial machine. China is more than 50% of papers today published on AI are done by Chinese scholars. Again, that is planned. That has been planned, has been like that very clearly for the last 10 years. They're fueling that, they're doing it, they have the brain power, they are training people, and they're right now operating in a market which is very competitive, and therefore all you have to do is read Kai-Fu Lee's book. It talks about the gladiators in China. If you're an entrepreneur in China, you learn how to survive in a way that no other entrepreneur in the world has to go through, and that's why they're very powerful. So the global South is, again, for me, is not the South anymore. For me, China is number one in many ways. And again, I've lived in India and I've seen the difference. The first time I went to China was in the 70s. I grew up in India in the 80s. And if I go back now, as I have, it's a completely different country. I used to come to Italy for vacation to go into the future when I was in Burma. Now, if I want to go into the future, I have to go to Shanghai. And that's the reality. But again, technology will shift things in the coming years. So it's good to try to preempt that, because as many were saying, there's not much that we can do right now to change the perception of what the West is doing, but maybe we can anticipate certain things that can happen, again, because of technological changes.
Thank you. Now is the time for Professor Pezzini, who is with us. I can see him.
Thank you. As I announced before, I am surprised because we have a lot of surprises that should lead us not to waste the surprise and revise our theoretical exhaustion, as Bonaventura named it. I think we have to do a sociology of the absence. What is lacking in our ideology, I would say. And I indicated 4 suggestions that are not exhaustive, but let me go through very quickly because some have already been mentioned, and I discussed several times with Antonio Bernardini this point. So the first is The idea that there is only one economic trajectory is that the developed countries have done it, they know the secret of it, and therefore they can teach the standards, the appropriate standards, like Dominican priests in mission, to the developing countries. In other terms, a theory of modernization that obviously doesn't work anymore. Let me just give you an example. It is obvious that the most important country in terms of development of the history that we have, including prehistory that we have, is China. Now, how China developed? We used to think that in order to develop, you need a Weberian bureaucracy. If there is a country without a Weberian bureaucracy, it's China, because we killed that bureaucracy, and then the Cultural Revolution ended the job. As a consequence, how can we continue to have this type of thinking and pretending that our economy is the best, and everybody else has to align to the standards that we have defined only among ourselves? The second assumption is the traditional idea that there is a bipolar world, as a kind of Cold War, where we have democracy in one hand against autocracy in the other hand. But it's very difficult to define what is the border of one and what is the border of the other. Moreover, there are countries in the supposed to be other field, like Uruguay, that are much more democracy than many other countries in the so-called democratic field, like Hungary, for example. On top of this, the United States considered to be the example, the ideal typical model. After the Capitol and after the Trump administration, there is no more doubt that they cannot be presented as the example of the democracy field that we want to promote. Third surprise or third claim that I think is completely wrong, the idea that the hegemony is just a matter of strong power and weapon. We have to rethink all this type of consideration and, for example, revalorize soft power, knowledge sharing, dialogue, if we want multilateralism. And here I come to my last point. When it comes to multilateralism, I agree with Jorge Eine and also with what Ambassador Ferrara said. We have to rebuild, in a certain sense, multilateralism. But we say we are in difficulties because at present, the existing global order is weakened. Is it a global order, the one that we have created? Let me just mention one or two examples. I worked for many years in OECD, as Antonio did as well. Now, OECD was created in 1961. OECD maintained the 24 member countries up to 1994, when the first southern country became member, which is Mexico. And in order to become member, has to leave the G77. Now, Mexico wants to go back to the G77. Anyhow, what were those years? These were the years of decolonization. And what have we done in multilateralism in an organization as important as the OECD? We have kept all these countries away. And we continue because now, if we look for southern country in OECD, we have just to add Colombia, Costa Rica, Chile, and that's it. So as a consequence, what type of order are we talking about? A global order or an order that was done without the so-called southern countries? The other greatest example is obviously the development cooperation policy, which is discussed, elaborated, designed in a committee that is called the Development Assistance Committee, or the DAC. Now, in the DAC, which is in the OECD, not even all OECD countries are members. Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico are members of the OECD, but not of the DAC. Israel, Turkey are members of the OECD, but not of the DAC. In 2011, the DAC proposed to India, Brazil, and China to not enter, to become kind of friends in something that was called the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. Why those countries of the South should accept to be the latest one, actually in a different separated table, to participate in a multilateral discourse? So we have a problem to reinvent the table and to make them from the scratch inclusive. I conclude by saying, I don't think it's easy. I think it's very difficult. Ambassador Ferrara gave us some ideas about it. I think that we have to do something that I would call multilateral experimentalism. On certain file, when possible, we should create tables that are inclusive, that are large, and probably open also to actors that are not only states. An example, the work that has been done on taxes. It was done with 145 countries from the south, from the north, to reach to an objective, increase the minimum level of tax for business. This is an example. We should move in other direction similar to this by experiment reforming the system. I don't think that just tackling the system as such now is really feasible. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I pass to give space to a possible third round, and I give the floor to Monsignor Yamengo.
Thank you very much. I appreciate a lot, and I take the time to insist, as I begin the last time, to speak about the necessity of change of the paradigmatic way we conceive the world. Because for many people from the global south, as someone say, the stigmatization and the polarization is beginning from the speech, the way the other speak of you, about you. And so still now in our part, some people are worried about the movement in, for example, sub-Saharan African peoples, but we are full of hope to change situation. And we don't want to dominate the world. No, we people want the right only to live. For example, when by the imposition of economic system and social system and industrial system, we obliged many states to privatize, for example, water and so on. And we become slave of a system, and it is a battle for freedom. And as I use the word Ubuntu, Ubuntu is really central and in each part of our cultures and religion, and it is, you see, sometimes African traditional religion is the one without proselytism. We want without the desire to convert anyone. We want to exist. And now, after the colonization and the domination of our cultures and the risk of cancellation of many cultures, I'm a Catholic priest, and in relationship with the wise men of the traditional system, I learn myself to welcome humbly what they teach us, because from acculturation and priesthood, I was first part of the dominators. And I first, in my homeland, part of Western people, these Western dominators for my own culture. And I do this conversion to welcome this traditional wisdom, and now we are listening to them, we are learning to rebuild how to live together. Are we able to live together? Are we able to sit together and to speak? And by the African traditional wisdom say yes, because when you say these people and me, we cannot sit under the same tree and share the same umbrage, it is because it is not night. When the night arrives, you will share all the same cover. And it is seems we need to learn to welcome life and to live and to protect one another. And it is the concept, fundamental concept with Ubuntu is the power of the king. Is we cannot explain the power of a king without the necessity of protecting the wicked people in his city. And unless we are not really preparing, educating for caring for wicked person, wicked people, I think this is not civilization, and we are on the way to distract ourselves and to distract the world where we live. And I think it is time to try really to weaponize our speech, and in the internet world where all our people are connected, to try to change the way to speak and to have, and I'm optimistic also, and Cecilia, we can do it, because if we don't do it, it is we let the things for the opposite, the other things, as Fitzgerald say once, if humankind don't put end to war, war will put end to humankind. And we need to avoid this.
Thank you. Now, I will ask Khalid to wait a moment and ask if anybody wants to make another intervention before Khalid makes his conclusive remarks. Does anybody want to make an intervention, please? Pezzini, please.
Just to add one little point, and the point is that from my observatory, that I don't pretend is the most appropriate one, it seems that there are growing agency of regions where the discussion at present is relatively intense. I'm referring, for example, to the African Union and the role that has played in the recent crisis, for example, the one related to the war in Ukraine. Now, this define a growing probably importance, at least in certain regions, of regional institutions as potential places for this multilateral experimentalism I was referring about. The only complaint is that I am noticing that the European Union, that has a big experience, probably one of the most relevant in this field, is not at present using his experience as a form of cooperation with these other regions, which is under my point of shame. But just to underline the relevance of the regional dimension, which is probably less true in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to make a comment? Ambassador Ferrara, please.
Very briefly, I do not think that the concept of hegemony was mentioned, that we can avoid hegemony by replacing hard power with soft power, because soft power is still power. I think that we really change of paradigm by replacing the concept of power in international system with the concept of care, which is a completely different perspective and very helpful for global governance. To the same token, and this is my second observation, we have to encourage a very difficult conceptual and paradigmatic transition from the idea of international politics to that of planetary politics. So to apply moral and political responsibility towards all the planets and all the living beings, and including future generation. I think this is the kind of mentality that we have to acquire to bring about a real change.
Thank you. Jorge, I saw you ask for intervention. Jorge Aine.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberto. Let me just say the following. On the question of the Global South, the question is not whether Burkina Faso is similar to India. The question is, how do the reaction of these various countries to the current moment in world affairs share a number of things in common? So to take the case of Gaza, the war in Gaza, which are the countries that have taken the lead in reacting to what is happening in Gaza? South Africa, taking the case to the International Court of Justice, saying that genocide is happening in Gaza. Brazil, as chair of the United Nations Security Council, bringing a resolution to the fore calling for a ceasefire, which was a resolution that was vetoed in the end. But Brazil taking that initiative. Namibia, saying, former state by President Aingo, saying that Germany had no place in being amicus curiae to Israel in the case brought about by South Africa, because Germany had the responsibility for the first genocide in the 20th century, the genocide committed against the Herero people in 1904, 1908, when Germany was the colonial power, and 70,000 of the Herero people were killed and massacred. Nicaragua, by bringing a case against Israel in the International Criminal Court. So what I am saying is that all these cases show the agency that is coming from the countries of the Global South on this issue that has been so critical. So again, it's not a question of the features that they share or not share. It is in their action, what we call active non-alignment, that commonality comes to the fore. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else is asking for time for intervention? I don't see anybody asking the floor. Okay, so we go to the Finelli here.
Just a comment, of course.
Remote,
we follow, I've been many times in Israel, Palestine, and I really believe that Europe is really missing a big chance at the moment to end this genocide, because it must be called what it is. Who knows the history of Israel and its colonialism, settlement colonialism system, and it was aimed from the beginning to this end. Now, either we stop Israel or they will not stop by themselves. And I fully agree with what Jorge said, that it's really a shame that we don't have the courage to support the South African, Namibian, and the rest case at the International Court. And so I fully agree.
Okay, thank you. I don't see anybody asking time for intervention. I take that the round has been concluded. Okay, so now the gatekeeper has finished his work. I give the floor to Khalid Malik for a global conclusion or comment, please.
First of all, let me thank Roberto for his vision, his humanity, his personal leadership, and for bringing us together. I want to thank all those who made this tremendously interesting comments. And Roberto was very kind. He said, you have 20 minutes to finish. I said, no, actually 10 minutes are fine because food is waiting, so we don't want to overstep our boundaries. Let me start with a very simple idea. First, leadership matters. Fundamentally, it matters. I was struck by that comment because it came up in several different ways. And I don't know if people remember Maurice Strong, very dear friend, great and Canadian, and actually he had a huge impact on the modern world. His vision on sustainability, on environmental work has spawned many agencies. He and I did a joint discussion presentation in New York, just before Rio Plus 20 in 2012. And a person who was in the 80s at that time, he said, and as he addressed these very sophisticated people, he said, our leaders have failed us. He's talking about climate change and sustainability. So we, all of us, have to become leaders. And this is our moral imperative. It's not just you and me and different roles we have done in the past. We have to leave this world in a slightly better way. And I was very struck by someone who spent his entire life trying to do good, improve things. And in his 80s, as we are preparing to go to Rio for the Rio Plus 20 conference, he makes this heartfelt call, and that stuck with me for a long time. So I hope that out of all of this, at least the commitment all of you have in improving things. I cannot but agree with Jorge on the issue of definitions of the Global South. You know, it's not us versus them issue fundamentally. Maybe it's been seen and perceived like that, but fundamentally it's not. The reality is that this change is taking place after a few hundred years. In the 17th century, China was 30% of the world's output. India was a bit less. And then there was a long decline that by the 1950s, China became only 5% of the world's GDP. India 1%. But the number of people in these two countries remained quite significant as a percent of the population. So these countries and many other countries, I talked about 40 plus countries who've done much better in developmental terms than the sheer predictions would have allowed us. So I think we are on I think this debate on the definition of Global South is not quite the right debate. The question is, what do we do with it? This tremendous change which is happening, how do we fix things? How do we make certain we're in a much more sustainable world? There was also a lot of discussion about ethics, values, guiding principles. You know, all of that was, I think, stated in a very profound way in the UN Charter, where we said, we the peoples, it's talked about war and peace issues, they talked about development issues, and later on the human rights issues. The sad reality is that the UN has not, as was also stated by some old friends, that we have not been able to somehow achieve what we were set out to do. And when you do not perform, other things happen. G7 happens, the G20 happens, BRICS happens, now the expanded BRICS. So in a sense, this is a balkanization effect of international relations, global relations. Somehow we have to find a way to go beyond that. And I would submit, and I'll come back to that, we have to do something by the UN first and foremost. I'll come back to that. I very, very much appreciate what President Oscar Arias mentioned about Costa Rica, and something I should mention to my friend Mashahid Hussain. We did and I mentioned this early in the beginning, that we gave a prize to Costa Rica for being, in the first 10 countries, Costa Rica was the only developing country we did as well as other countries. So we decided to give them a prize. And it was not, that decision on abolishing the army was very profound. It led to many other things, investing in education, people, but also in environment. 70% of Costa Rica is under forest cover. They started with 30%. I mean, imagine the sheer changes which took place. So peace is good for development, fundamentally, and development is good for peace. But unfortunately, the development agenda has a lot of issues and problems fundamentally. I think Roberto argued very well about Washington consensus, and we've been bedeviled by it. But look at what's happening now. the decision by the US Reserve Bank to raise interest rates caused a huge amount of problems for developing countries. The debt went up dramatically. And what happens when the debt goes up dramatically because of decision taken somewhere else? Then you're forced to go back to the same people to find a way to do debt forgiveness or push the debt forward. All kind of complicated issues come up. And that's why the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, tried to raise very recently a call, we must fix this financial architecture to make it more equitable, make it more sensible. Joe Stiglitz and I have done some work together. He highlighted that actually when you dig into all the budgets, you'll be surprised how much goes to security. In the US budget, $600 billion goes to the army. But when you dig into all the other elements, actually the total is $1.3 trillion. But that puts a lot of pressure on health, on education, social security. You must find a way which puts people first and foremost. And that has been with us for a while. And I'm trying to argue that maybe the time has come because power is being complicated, because of we have to move from multipolarity, which is happening right now, to multilateralism. Go back to the vision people had of the United Nations. To move from armies and securities to development. Some years ago, the report which I was responsible for in the office launched the term called human security. And that captures well freedom from want and freedom from fear, two freedoms. This development addresses a lot of the want, and we have to find a way, collective agreements, learning from each other, the freedom from fear. There's been discussion, and I've also conveyed an idea that maybe it's time for us to have a new Earth Charter, which, Maurice Strong, again, was very much behind this idea of the Earth Charter, and it had its momentum. He and Mikhail Gorbachev pushed this idea, but gradually it slowed down. There was a big movement in the countries to make it happen. Maybe we need to reignite some of these things, but which takes into account of putting people first in a poor environment, because in the end, peace is good for development and development is good for peace. And optimism is fundamental to the human condition, should be fundamental to the human condition. We have to keep thinking we can do better, because that defines our actions, and we can then hopefully do better as well. It's not that doing better is easy. It's not that, if you read about Mahatma Gandhi and, the non-violence or passive resistance was a hugely difficult personal decision because you're getting beaten up and you're not responding to that. So the collective humanity becomes a way of harnessing the energies human beings have for good and for better. And I hope that all this is not seen as a clash of civilizations or clash between groups. We really have to move to a way where this is an opportunity. I think this is an opportunity for doing better. I hope people see this as a personal and collective responsibility to do exactly that. And with the final word, I want to thank our dear friend Roberto Savio for being a wonderful example for us. We have another common friend, Arsenio Rodriguez, who at times says, "Oh, I'm getting old." I said, "Look, here we have Roberto, who has been a great example." And I loved the way when he put the list together, he put himself as social activist. We all have to become leaders in that spirit. Thank you very much.
Well, now as host, I'm supposed to say a few words with some aesthetic for closing. But Khalid has steered me some personal parts which I want to share. I went to China the first time in 1957 as one of the representatives of the Italian movement of students. were two delegates, Bettino Craxi for the non-Catholic and me for the Catholic. China were 600 million people. At that time, their challenge was to produce enough steel as England. That was the big dream in which all Chinese people were mobilized. And of course, globalization, in the word of Kissinger, who I always thought was a very brilliant thinker, but always a little bit too short-term looking. Kissinger said globalization is the key word for American dominance. But once you open the rules of globalization, anybody can participate. And this is what happened. Globalization has opened the door to everybody, to the World Trade Organization, to all the development that we had, that by the way, went out of the United Nations. We're not inside the United Nations, let us not forget, and create a situation where from a country of 600 million, today 1.35. I still remember, close to our hotel, there was a square, a round square, very British, with a garden in the middle, and there was a gate around the garden. And on the gate, they still left a sign in blue and white, which say, no Chinamen and dog are admitted. I took a picture of that. And that is how China was coming in relation with the world, which went through a very self-insulating system. When I went to China, there were no foreigners of any type, no journalists, no tourists, nothing. When we walked in the street, people stopped to look at us because they found foreigners unbelievable. So I want to say that China is the symbol of the passing of the time, and I have to say also of the decline of Europe. Because at the time of the Opium War, which are a page of shame for Europe, well, Great Britain were 52 million, and China were 275. But Chinese had the superior technology in military terms. They were able to invade China, conquer China, and subject China and oblige China to buy opium, to balance the trade with England. Today, no British, even Nigel, even the most ferocious nationalist would never think of invading China. The relation of forces has completely changed. And Europe was 25% of the world population. Now we are close to 6%. And this affects, we have a demographic crisis that we are not contemplating at all in real terms. But that said, I want to say that we did not have really a brainstorming. There was not a storm. I would say we had rolls of the wind, where with the breeze went through us, we exchanged views. I was very much impressed that did not come out a clear north-south divide in the debate, as could have been, because finally we were representing personal experience, personal travels from different geographical reality. In fact, we were much more global than regional, let's say. And I think this is an important element to underline, to say that there was a communality among all of us, even with different approaches and perceptions. Now, the other point that I want to remind is that we did not invite anybody from China, from the United States, and from Russia, deliberately, because to do that would have created a debate totally different from the one we had. And we choose to do so. I think this experience shows that we were not wrong, because finally we have been able to stay together, by and large, in a field of definition and analysis, which is given us a sense of participation and not of division. And the other thing that I want to say is that it is very difficult today, in my view, to debate projection in international affairs, because the element of uncertainty are many more the element of certainty. You could very well say that in the history of the world, certainty about the future was never there, and you're right. But we never had the time of so diffuse fronts of uncertainty. We have now global fronts of uncertainty, from climate to finance. And citizens feel powerless in front of this. And this is one problem we have today. And projection in international affairs is extremely difficult. Now, we have come up here with different ideas, different definition, different perspective. I think that it will not take long. It will take the next electoral cycle, 2028, because this cycle is under a clear, let us say, wave, which is worldwide. It's not something only in Europe. In Europe, we're going to see this happening with the European election, but this is everywhere it will go. And it will take at least one cycle, if not two, in my view, so 28 or 32, until all these fashion, let us call them, which now make politics, and which claim to be able to solve problems that exist, but they piggyback to become power, will take one or two cycles to see that those forces do not have either solution. Not only the traditional party did not have a solution, but also these newcomers do not have a solution, for reasons which we're not going to discuss here, but which are objective. And then what will happen? Either the political system will learn from its mistake and will be able again to become an open system, not self-referent, open to citizen participation, able to express the wish, the feeling, the interest, the illusion, the hopes of people, or unfortunately we are going to have in a period of dictatorship. All these two trends are going to affect very much international relations. And as Indira Gandhi said, an optimist is a pessimist without all the data. So I am an optimist, but I'm afraid I do not have all the data. That said, I want to thank everybody for coming here or staying with us via the space. Thanks to new technologies, we can do that. We shared 2 hours and a half of lively debate and ideas. I think all of us come here with more ideas than we came in, And this is the main purpose of dialogue and learning, that are things which are not disappearing. So thank you very much to everybody, and other news is always at your disposal.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Merci de l'intervention parce qu'elle est très fort utile.
Grazie, merci.